Okay, if you've ever been to a church that's more charismatic or Pentecostal, you've probably heard them speaking in tongues in the church service. Or maybe you go to a church that's like that, or maybe you listen to a lot of worship music online and you hear them speaking in tongues. And so the question I want to address in today's video is, should we do that? Should we speak in tongues in public? What does the Bible have to say about it? And in order to learn about it, we need to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Paul writes there to the church in Corinth, he says, "Let love be your highest goal, but you should also desire the special abilities the Spirit gives, especially the ability to prophesy." And then he starts talking about speaking in tongues. He says, "A person who speaks in tongues is strengthened personally, but one who speaks a word of prophecy strengthens the entire church." Now, let me try to explain what's going on here in chapter 14. First of all, the church in Corinth had a self-centered focus on the gift of tongues. I encourage you to go back and read the entire chapter for yourself. In fact, go back to chapter 12 and chapter 13 because it all forms one big section where Paul is answering some questions that they have about public worship and how to do a church service and what matters and all that kind of stuff. And I want to make sure that you understand the context here. Apparently, some of the Corinthians, some of the believers in Corinth started to feel pretty arrogant, pretty proud about the gift of tongues. And so some of them, apparently, as you read this chapter, some of them were speaking in tongues so much that it was kind of taking over the public worship service. And I'm sure it was making the people who didn't do it feel really bad about themselves. And so Paul goes on to explain it like this. He said, "There are many different languages in the world, and every language has a meaning. But if I don't understand a language, I will be a foreigner to someone who speaks it. And the one who speaks it will be a foreigner to me. And the same is true for you." And so he says this, "Since you are so eager to have the special abilities the Spirit gives, seek those that will strengthen the whole church." Paul is explaining that a gift that edifies everyone, namely the gift of prophecy in chapter 14, is more helpful than a gift that edifies only the believer, which in this case is the gift of tongues. Now, you can go back and read this for yourself. I want to make sure you understand what prophecy is. It's not like predicting what's going to happen in the future. He's talking about speaking God's truth to the congregation, much like what we would do in our teaching. He says that makes sense because you're doing it in a language that everyone understands. Whereas when somebody gets up there and speaks in a tongue or a foreign language, a language that nobody there understands, it's not really helpful to anybody. It only sort of strengthens and edifies the individual believer. That's why he says in verse 18, "I thank God that I speak in tongues more than any of you, but in a church meeting, I would rather speak 5 understandable words to help others than 10,000 words in an unknown language." Now, I want to talk for a second to those of you who do speak in tongues and who do it in a public setting and you don't give any thought to who's around you. I think it's important for you to study and pray about what Paul is saying here because I think he's speaking to those of us who do have this gift. He's saying you need to be careful about how you exercise this gift in a public setting. It's not a bad gift. It's a gift from God. It's a great thing. In fact, Paul says he does it all the time, but apparently he's talking about doing it in private. When it comes to a church meeting, however, he says, "I'd rather speak in a language everyone understands." And then he says this in verse 23, "Even so, if unbelievers or people who don't understand these things come into your church meeting and they hear everyone speaking in an unknown language, they will think you are crazy. But if you're all prophesying, and if unbelievers or people who don't understand these things come into your meeting, then they're going to be convicted of sin and judged by what you say." Paul is compelling us in public to give up things we love, like the gift of tongues, for things that we love more or that we should love more, like helping other people, helping unbelievers come to hear and know the gospel. After all, remember how he started this whole chapter. In verse 1, he said, "Let love be your highest goal." Don't let your desire for spiritual gifts like tongues be your highest goal, because sometimes that can be in competition with love for neighbors, love for other Christians, and even love for non-believers. So, should you speak in tongues in public? Here's what I would say. At the very least, if you know that there are non-believers there who wouldn't understand what you're doing, then I would say don't speak in tongues in that particular context. If you're with a bunch of Christians who all get it, they all are comfortable with it, and you're just worshiping together, I would say go for it. That's what I think is a great way to interpret 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Why don't you tell me what you think about it, or maybe some of the experiences you've had in this area in the comments below?